10 years ago, Hurricane Joaquin took the lives of the 33 crew members aboard SS El Faro, including 5 Maine Maritime Academy graduates. Well, yesterday, a remembrance ceremony was held in their honor. The ceremony took place at the El Faro Salute sculpture in Rockland, a memorial made to commemorate the lives lost aboard the ship. Friends, family, and members of the maritime community spoke kind words and told stories of those lost. Their memories were honored with prayers, reflection, and the ringing of 8 bells, a traditional show of respect to deceased mariners. Jay Sawyer, sculptor of El Faro Salute, says that he hopes the memory of the incident can prevent further tragedies from occurring.
In this particular case, there's lessons to be learned, and so it's very important in that way. A lot of safety recommendations and safety upgrades and all. And and to keep that memory alive, not just of the crew, but the tragedy itself. So with any luck, it won't happen again.
Wednesday, October 1st, marks the anniversary of the El Faro's sinking. An additional ceremony will be held in Jacksonville, Florida on that day.